Criminal homicide comprises two key forms, murder and involuntary manslaughter. Both forms have a similar actus reus, namely an unlawful killing of a human being. Murder requires the killing to be accompanied by an intention to kill and intention to cause previous bodily harm. Manslaughter does not. Manslaughter does require proof of fault, but the nature of that fault varies according to the type of manslaughter charged. Reckless manslaughter requires foresight of death or serious injury. Gross negligence manslaughter requires no foresight but a very high degree of negligence as to the risk of death. Constructive manslaughter requires neither foresight nor even negligence as to the risk of death. This requires simply the commission of the crime likely to cause harm with the relevant mens rea for the crime. The common element in killing homicide are the prime conduct constructed by an unlawful killing of a human being. The common element in criminal homicide are the prime conduct elements constituted by an unlawful killing of a human being. These elements comprises a killing, an unlawful killing, and a human victim. A killing in the context follows the general template of all criminal offences. It requires an act in the case of murder and gross negligence manslaughter, but does not construct manslaughter, an omission in breach of duty. Traditionally, the fault element in murder is described as malice aforethought. However, it is better to forget this form of words, which was coined in an earlier, less definition-driven age. Neither malice nor premeditation is required. A killing done intentionally at the heat of the moment is just as much murder as one which has been planned and premeditated. An intentional killing is murder if prompted by compassion as much as it is prompted by greed. Apart from the general defenses, murder is served by three special defenses which, if successful, reduce the murder conviction to a conviction for voluntary manslaughter. It is called voluntary manslaughter because the prosecution can prove the killing was voluntary, but the context provides a degree of mitigation which would render the mandatory sentence unjust. We shall be covering here two of these partial defenses, namely loss of control and diminished responsibility. Provocation still applies in relation to killings preceding 2009 and so will be dealt with very briefly here. It is similar in structure to the defense which replaces it, namely loss of control. Moreover, many of the principles underlying the defense are similar to those underlying the new defenses, so it is useful to read this section carefully. Provocation had a subjectively and objectively element. Loss of self-control which has not been triggered by another's deed or action is not covered by the defense. The requirement of loss of self-control excluded revenge and other premeditated killings from the coverage of the defense. It was long thought to mean that defense could not be relied upon if there was a time lapse between the last piece of provocation and the killing. Provocation requires the loss of self-control. It did not necessarily follow that it should be by way of immediate reaction. In particular, a woman of subject to cumulative domestic abuse might lose her self-control after a period of slow burn, simmering anger which erupts long after the last provocation event. So long as the killing was by way of loss of self-control and not revenge or premeditation, the defense remained available. The objective element was that the defendant's conduct should be consistent with that of reasonable people faced with a similar trigger. In deciding this question, the jury was to take into account by characteristics of the defendant which made the acts no words of the provocation. For example, their race, size, weight, color, hair color, habits, and sexuality. If this was the target of the provocation, the jury not to take into account any characteristics which may have reduced the defendant's self-control below the reasonable person. Like provocation, the defense contains a subjective hurdle, requires a loss of self-control which is caused by what is termed as qualifying trigger. The first qualifying trigger is fear of serious violence. Specifically, it operates where D's loss of self-control was attributable to D's fear of serious violence from V against D or another identical person. A typical scenario covered this trigger is the person who, after a period of cumulative violence, snaps and kills the tormentor. The fear must trigger a loss of control rather than a desire to be avenged or a rational decision to put an end to an ongoing source of torment. This is qualifying trigger would have also covered